You write words for me to read, a string of memories that place me inside the eyes of the child you were, a daughter of Honduras, of Mexico and of Puerto Rico, and of the Central Valley of California, with its flat, dry plains covered with crops and cows, and towns filled with paisas and their chickens. You sit in my office and begin to weep as you tell me the story of your undocumented boyfriend and the demons that haunt him, and it's clear to me that you should break up with him, even though I cannot say this. You tell me about your best friend, a white girl, and about the African-American family who live next door. In your stories, I see a suburb of rectangular lawns and a rancho in the rural United States, where the neighbors heard your mother and father yelling at each other, and where you took solace in the natural beauty of your surroundings, in the crisp desert wind and the muddy yellow outline of mountain ranges. You write, I am having a nervous breakdown, but your prose belies this. Controlled and precise, it tells a story of violation and survival you endured when you were a kindergartner.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Turn the Page. Today we're at the Arroyo Seco Regional Branch Library, and I'm so happy to welcome Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, novelist, nonfiction writer, recent author of Our Migrant Souls, and professor at the University of California, Irvine, Héctor Tobar. So, Héctor, welcome to our program today. It's so lovely to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I wanted to start off, first of all, by congratulating you on your newest collection. I say collection because I'm a poet. Your newest book, Our Migrant Souls. Congratulations on that publication. I think a very important contribution to the canon on these topics that we're going to discuss today. In the title, you reference it as a meditation on race and the meanings and myths of Latino. And it made me wonder, what were maybe the top two myths you were trying to explain in this book?
Wow, well, I think that mainly the idea that Latino people are a threat to American identity. I think that one of the dominant images in the media of our time is of border crossers from Latin America coming to the border fence and being some sort of a threat to the social order, to our well-being.
Yes.
And so to me, that's the main myth about Latino people. And to me, the truth about Latino, Latinx identity is that we're contributing to this country. The country is essentially becoming a Latino country. In many different kind of ways. Latino emotionality, Latino culture are seeping into the everyday life of the country. So there's that, and there's also the myth that Latino really means any sort of one thing, because Latino is this kind of collection, this mixture of cultures, these collision of cultures. It's African, it's indigenous, it's European. And so all of us Latino people, we usually carry a mixture of these many different identities that, through a series of accidents of American history, are called Latino.
Well, and with respect to your first point, I have maintained privately, I'm not a scholar, but it seems to me it's not becoming more Latino, but returning.
Oh.
Because if we study history, we know that California and much of the Southwest, yes, I get it, there was a war or several wars, but this was originally part of what we would now call Mexico. So this idea that it's becoming, I always think, yeah, okay, we're going back historically to what the land was before colonization. I'll put it that way.
Right, absolutely. I mean, we're sitting on Tongva land.
Exactly.
My home is about a quarter mile from this spot, my regional branch library, and we have black walnut trees that were sacred to the Tongva people. But even beyond that, the entire United States is a place of cultural encounters. It's never really ever been one thing. From the moment that the first colonies are created, it's a cultural collision. The colonists themselves are from many different cultures. So the United States really has always been a place of encounters.
Absolutely, and it struck me reading the book that this was a very specific treatise on Latino, Latinx, Hispanic, and we'll get into that shortly, but that this applies to descendants of the African diaspora. We so easily say Asian American without differentiating Korean, Vietnamese, Cambodian, Chinese, etc., to the indigenous people of this land. And so it really had that kind of universal in the specific of what you were talking about. And you do talk about that a little bit in the book as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the story of what Latino is and what Latino means in the United States is a very specific story. It's specific to the story of a Cuban immigrant, or a Guatemalan immigrant, or a Texan whose family goes back 300 years and had the border cross them, as they say in Texas.
Yes.
But it is also this story within the American story. And to me, as a lifelong student of American history, as a kid who would wander in a library like this one and head to the American history section, I mean, to me, the way that the story of Latino has these parallels is and interwoven with all these other stories, with the story of Jewish migration, the Black migration, all the many diasporas that make Los Angeles. To me, that's what's really interesting.
And are you feeling, or were you feeling as you wrote the book, as I am, and so many others are feeling, that these histories are particularly important at this time in American culture, politically, what's going on, because they're the stories that are trying to be quashed in some quarters?
Oh, absolutely. I think that a lot of people who grow up Latino, Latinx in this time have a diminished sense of themselves. They feel like they are the products of a broken people, that by definition, they're people whose descendants had to run away and flee. And my book, it means to explain to them that this is the American normal. The United States depends on migrant labor, always has, importing labor, right? Absolutely. This is why the importation of slaves leads to the first really big dominant racial categories in this country, which are white and black.
Right.
No human being is truly white or black. These are just abstractions, inventions, categories created. Latino is a category like that. And in the root of this identity, though, there are these stories, these journeys that make us Latino. This border crossing, establishing a new home, moving to a new neighborhood, learning a new language.
Exactly. I was going to ask you about that. Sometimes leaving your, not only your language, but even more subtly. So my parents were immigrants from the Caribbean, and their Caribbean references and terminologies were somewhat lost, with some examples that they couldn't shake, and you'd think, what does that mean? Because they're bringing that from home, and that's the piece of them that they want to keep. So I could very much identify in so many ways, and I think those who read your book will be able to find bits and pieces, if it's their parents or their grandparents, in those stories. But before we get too much more deeply into the book, so our Migrant Souls came out in 2023, I believe.
Correct, yes.
And then you had the novel, The Last Great Road Bum in 2020. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, man, Hector is so prolific, in addition to your teaching responsibilities at UCI. And so I find that listeners and readers are often interested in process and how we do what we do. So I wanted to hopefully get some tips as to what your writing process is. How do you find the time? What is your practice in terms of regular, because a lot of this book is a travelogue.
Absolutely.
From your meeting with people across the country and outside of the country. So when does the writing come in?
After teaching writing for many years and my own sort of life as a writer, that there's really two groups of writers. There's the morning writers and the night writers.
Yes.
There's a few oddballs who write in the middle of the day,
right.
But most of us seek out those times when it's quiet.
Exactly.
And so I'm a morning writer. And since my kids were born more than 20 years ago, I've started writing at 6 o'clock in the morning. I used to write before they woke up, in the morning before they had to go off to school. They're all grown up now.
Yes.
So I usually write 3 hours or so a day in the morning.
Yes.
By 9 o'clock, 9:30, I'm usually done working my most intense focus on the writing. Later, I might do some revision in the afternoon. I'll do research.
Right.
I'll wander to a place like this. I wandered into this particular library when I was researching my most recent novel that might come out in a couple of years, I don't know. And so, yeah, you know, it's that process of intense concentration, 3 hours a day, but then also, you know, your whole day, you're soaking up life.
Exactly.
You're soaking up life, and you might be dry. Many times I've driven on the 110 freeway, not too far from here,
Right.
and had an idea in the middle of the freeway or washing the dishes.
Exactly.
And so you're really working all day in that sense.
I couldn't agree with you more. I've told people from time to time, I said, if I'm reading someone else, I'm working.
That's right.
Because something that I'm getting from that book may explicitly show up or influence what I'm working on at the time. So the whole process of bringing a work to life is living that life, not only when you're sitting down specifically doing it. So I feel validated and vindicated now. Over what period of time, because this did involve travel, were you writing Our Migrant Souls? I think I read somewhere it was 10 years since you had written your previous nonfiction book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I started it right at the beginning of the pandemic.
Okay.
So I had taught my last class before going away in a fellowship for a year. I was very lucky to get a fellowship at Harvard, which I did online.
Nice.
So I went to Harvard online
Yeah.
and wrote my book. And so that was the beginning of the pandemic year. I had all the voices of my students from the last class I taught. The opening chapter of the book, which references a lot of my students' stories, is just from me having taught a class and hearing their voices in my head. And then I wrote it, most of it during the pandemic. And then towards the end of the writing process, as I was finishing the book, I got an assignment from Harper's Magazine. And they said, look, we want you to write about the Latino vote in the wake of the 2020 election. And so in 2021, early 2021, I set off on the road. The country was awakening from the pandemic, but I got in my car, went and drove from city to city and interviewed people. And I drove about 9,000 miles, total in a couple of road trips that I took at the end of the pandemic and right after.
Right after the pandemic. Yeah. And I was going to ask you that about the students. I found it very moving and effective that you were addressing them, and wondered, was that the idea from the beginning, or did it kind of evolve over time as you were working on it, that these are the people that I really want to reach in terms of their stories and their understanding of their histories?
Well, when I started the book, right from the very beginning, I had the idea of that direct address, and it comes from James Baldwin.
Yes.
It comes from The Fire Next Time, which I have to admit I read later in life than I should have, and it just absolutely blew me away. The Fire Next Time is this beautiful essay written in the 1960s at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, in which James Baldwin writes in this voice of anger and hurt to his young nephew. Describing the world into which he's being born, the history of his community, the racism to which he is going to be subjected and which to his people are subjected. And so that voice is definitely was right from the very beginning. And of course, Ta-Nehisi Coates does something very similar.
Letter to his son.
In Letter to his son. And I didn't want to do exactly the same thing.
Right.
And I had this group of young people who I mentor and teach, who come into my office, and I just, I thought of them, and I wanted to write, really the book begins as a book to them.
Well, and this is an example of what we're talking about in terms of how other writers in particular, but maybe other creative types, influence something we're working on. When you think, I kind of like that idea of address, but I don't want to repeat what's been done before. And you've got this built-in, your students must be thrilled at the idea that you were addressing them, and that the book jumps off from there.
Well, the ones who I've heard back from, who recognize little pieces of themselves in the book, are happy. And, one said, it's just really nice to see that he's actually reading our papers.
Yes.
Because I think they think that we professors aren't really reading, that we have some sort of machine that is processing their papers. But no, I read all of my students' papers, sometimes 200 students, and I'm reading their short essays. But yeah, there has been a very positive response, I have to say. Yes.
And that there's this circular education process where they are learning from you. But I've heard so many professors say, I learn every day from my students because they're living a life maybe 20 years removed from when I was that age or whatever number of years it is. So there's so much to be learned about where their minds are, what they're thinking about. Exactly. And that really comes through, I think, as you're thinking about that, as you're developing the ideas of the book. You're also a highly praised journalist, and I did feel a little bit of the journalist's eye in this book and started thinking about the fiction and the nonfiction and the journalistic influences and how you specifically address them or decide not to address them in your writing, in writing particularly of this book, let's say.
Yeah, I think that that journalism teaches you to be observant.
Yes.
Because you have to write stories that are really other people's stories, and so you have to first of all go to their home, go to their neighborhoods, see a place you've never been to before,
yes.
And then have them open up to you and tell you a story that they really need to tell you, but you have no idea what it is.
Right.
And so there's this process of building trust with people, and of feeling what the truth is of a community.
Right.
And so yes, journalism is something that made me into a writer. I had no idea that writing was a profession until I started volunteering for a community newspaper and writing for it. And it became, it was my entry into what would later become a literary life.
Right. Right.
And it trained me about the power too of language. Something when you witness something, and you're able to describe it and transmit that experience of witnessing. Absolutely. Witnessing the mourning of a mother who's lost her child, witnessing the burning of a city, yes. Witnessing a beautiful a college graduation, a reinvention. Right. All those things are just it's a real privilege to be a witness and then to be a storyteller.
I was also interested, before we get to that, I don't want to skip this part. As we sit here in this gorgeous library, yes. And to get the chance to talk about that a little bit, because as you're talking about language, and I'm looking at the books over our shelves, talk a little bit about the importance of the library for you, no matter what genre you're writing in.
Well, I grew up going to the Los Angeles Public Library. The Cahuenga branch in Hollywood was my first branch. My father, when he came to the United States from Guatemala, a young man of about 21, his wife pregnant with me, they lived a block from this library. An old Carnegie library, built with Andrew Carnegie's money. And so when I was about 5 or 6 years old, I got my first ID card. It was my cardboard, library card with my name yes. on it. And it was just this idea of civilization available to me, humble right. son of immigrants.
Right.
And my father especially always talked about books with such reverence.
Yes.
And about, writing with such reverence. And so the library was where I would come, and it's, I remember my high school libraries. And when I went to college, I spent as much time at the McHenry Library at UC Santa Cruz as I did in my classes.
Yes, exactly.
And it's just, being able to wander the stacks, to have chance, or when you wander to a library, you're in a curated space.
Absolutely.
And you have this intelligent, creative, caring person called a librarian
right.
who's chosen these books for you to wander through.
Exactly.
And they have many missions. They're trying to give you a big, choice of things. They're trying to capture what's essential or what's new. And so to be in the space, you're entering a space of love, a space right. that many, many people have created
exactly.
through an act of love, exactly. a love of reading and a love of people.
Exactly. And you know the world is in there. I just so clearly
yes.
remember thinking as a child, what is in those books? There must be
right.
something in books, because people are walking around with books. So I want to know what that is. So it's one of the reasons I'm so glad that we're here at a library that is literally your local library.
I'm Dora Suarez. I'm the branch manager of the Arroyo Seco Regional Library. I'm responsible for the day-to-day activities, as well as doing reference and the adult programming. I've been with the library for 28 years, 17 years here at the Arroyo Seco Library. I walked into the library and the librarian was hosting a program for the summer. And I was like, oh, this is fun. So I asked her what it took to be a librarian, and she guided me. And as a matter of fact, she is still the senior librarian at Los Feliz. So I still know her. I mean, she was my motivation. I love it every day. Every day is a new adventure. Working with the public, working with children specifically, creating programs for them, that's the best. For programs, we've had a running book club that's lasted 15 years. They meet every fourth Saturday of the month at 3 o'clock. As well as children's programs, we have baby and toddler story time at 10:30, Tuesdays and Wednesdays. We've been at the same location for 110 years. We have 3 buildings in the same location. Our first building was a Carnegie building, opened in February 1914. Our second building was a 60s building, and we also got a mural in 1995 by Luis Becerra. That mural stayed with us when we had this particular building, and that opened in 2002. And the building itself, the uniqueness of it is at the front, we have the Arroyo River Rock that mimics neighborhood buildings like the Lummis House and the Abbey. And also it mimics the old building, the Carnegie building, with its Art Deco and mission style architect. Some people say, oh, I didn't know this was a library. I thought it was a castle because of that, because of the front, the exterior. But yeah, we are a public library. It's fairly big, it's very nice inside. It has 2 floors, and most libraries do not have 2 floors. We're unique to that. And we also have a very large community room that's always used. Check out lepl.org, and they can find our calendar of events with all the activities that we have.
I'm wondering for our audience how we can help our children who are either the children or grandchildren or maybe great-grandchildren of immigrants who have perhaps a very different idea of what America is than their children do, who are trying to assimilate into this culture while their ancestors, their elders are saying, but you need to retain a little bit of home,
right.
Either through the foods or the language or both or something else. How do you think of that, perhaps with your own children?
Well, I think that there is a deep hunger among the young generation of today, and I see this in my students, to connect with something that's meaningful beyond this consumerist culture in which we live.
Yes.
So I know that there's a hunger for a lot of students to learn about their indigeneity,
Yes.
To learn the history of their home country, to think of it. They know that there's something really essential about that village in Mexico, that town in Colombia, you know, that town in the Caribbean.
Yes.
I have a student who's Dominican who writes about going back to his mother's village in the Dominican Republic. So I think there's a real hunger for that.
Yes.
I think that there is a sense that it's what makes us strong when in the challenges of our time. We live through a time of challenges. We live through a time of growing inequality.
Exactly.
Young people are dealing with so many things that sort of feed depressions and anxiety, and just having something solid in your roots. Right. I think this is why, this is one of the main gifts of Black and Latinx and Asian identity. Is this? It's a set of ideas about who I am that help me survive, difficulties, help me survive a catastrophe.
One of the reasons I think that Henry Louis Gates's program, Finding Your Roots.
Yes.
People love that program, and they're saying, I didn't know this, and my dad didn't tell me, and my mom didn't tell me. And so there's clearly a hunger there to understand, why do I feel this way, or don't I feel this way? What did I get from my family, who so often are reticent to talk about it?
And absolutely, and there are real important lessons to be learned from our personal histories.
Absolutely.
There are lessons about power and empire, inequality,
Yes.
Resilience.
Yes.
your average African American family has this story of a migration, of resilience, of oppression, of degradation,
And survival,
right? And
nevertheless.
survival,
Yes, exactly.
And this is, and these are things that are present in our being.
Yes. Yeah.
You know,
They're in our marrow.
They're in our marrow,
Yeah,
even though we might be middle class, college educated people in the present. We have these experiences that are part of our cultural DNA.
Absolutely.
And they're not in the mainstream, really. They're not spoken of.
They're not spoken of. And even more so these days, it feels as though you really shouldn't talk about those things when they're the most fundamental to who we are as human beings and to trying to develop an empathy for the other.
Absolutely.
So you're from Guatemala, my mother's from Beckway. But there's a lot of commonality there in terms of what your mother and my mother experienced coming here. So to me, that contributes to the richness of what this country is, despite the current public discourse. Well, I didn't want to let you go before I asked. I've been traveling recently and reminded how Americans think we're the center of the universe when we are so not the center of the universe. And wondered if the book has been translated and how it's being received, if you know, particularly in Guatemala, but in other parts of the world.
Oh, wow. It's going to be translated. It's being translated into Spanish.
Wonderful.
And in the fall of 2024, will be released in Spanish and in paperback. I've heard back from my mother in Guatemala.
The most important critic of all.
Who was very, very pleased that there's a picture of her.
Yes.
In the inside cover, the first pages, the title page has a picture of my mother and me when she arrived, and I was a little boy in front of the Griffith Observatory. So my mother is very pleased. There were some things about our family that I revealed that I was worried about.
Sure.
She's managed to read over those.
Just turn the page.
My mother every year tells me the story of my conception. I say in the book, there's two kinds of moms: those who will tell you the dirty details of your conception, and those who won't.
Right.
And my mother is in the former category. And so this year, for Mother's Day, I called her, and once again, she remembered the moment in which she became a mom.
Yes.
And it's been widely read.
Yes.
Among many different kinds of people. And I look forward to its insertion into Latin America soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that it's going to be such a treasure to look from the other side of the story of how we're relating to it here in this country. But we don't forget you. We know that you're reading this and thinking about the children and the grandchildren that have crossed the border. Well, before we go, would you give our listeners just a little hint of what your new novel is about?
Yes, I am writing a series of novellas about Los Angeles' future and its history.
Nice.
So it's 9 novellas that are grouped into 3 trilogies, so 3 novels with 3 sections each. And it begins 500 years in Los Angeles' future and eventually goes all the way back to the arrival of the first Europeans and the establishment of the Tongva people here in Southern California.
Goodness, it
so
sounds
it's just a little bit ambitious.
Just a little ambitious. This is why I'm a poet. 40 lines, you're in, you're out, you're done. So I have great admiration for prose writers, but we will look forward to that with great enthusiasm. I want to thank you so much for coming in and speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me. It was an honor.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Read our Migrant Souls. It's a fabulous book. You'll be glad you did.